I had always been drawn to abandoned places, but the old asylum on the outskirts of town was different. It was a place no one talked about, a place where the local kids dared each other to go, but never did. For years, it stood there, crumbling and overgrown with ivy, a relic of a darker time. No one seemed to know much about its history, but rumors swirled, stories of inhumane treatments, unmarked graves, and screams that could still be heard late at night. Naturally, I had to see it for myself. My friend Charlie and I decided to explore it one weekend, armed with flashlights and a camera to document our adventure. The sun was just starting to set when we reached the asylum, casting long shadows over the broken windows and cracked walls. The place looked even more intimidating up close, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to step inside. "Creepy as hell," Charlie muttered, but there was a grin on his face. We both loved the thrill of urban exploration, the adrenaline rush that came from sneaking into places we shouldn't be. We pushed open the rusted front doors, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. Old medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, forgotten and rusted, and the faint smell of mold hung in the air. "This place is a gold mine," Charlie said, raising his camera. "Look at this stuff." But as we moved deeper into the asylum, the excitement started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The air seemed colder here, and the silence was oppressive, like the building was swallowing up any sound we made. The hallways were long and narrow, lined with broken doors that led to patient rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. Some still had beds in them, rusted and stained, while others had strange markings scratched into the walls. We were about to head down another hallway when we heard it, a faint noise, like the soft creak of a door opening somewhere in the distance. Charlie and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart starting to race. We stood still, listening, but the noise didn't come again. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. We continued exploring, but the atmosphere had changed. I felt like we were being watched, like the shadows were growing darker and closing in on us. Every time we turned a corner, I half expected to see something or someone waiting for us. And then we found the basement. The entrance was hidden behind a pile of debris, a small rusted door that led down a narrow staircase. We hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us, and we descended into the darkness. The air down there was colder, damper, and the smell of mold was stronger. Our flashlights barely cut through the thick gloom as we reached the bottom. The basement was even more unsettling than the upper floors. The walls were lined with small cells, their doors hanging open. Inside, we found strange symbols scrawled on the floors and walls, symbols that looked old, like they'd been there for decades. Chains hung from the ceiling in some of the rooms, and I shuddered to think what they might have been used for. "This place gives me the creeps," Charlie whispered, his voice shaky for the first time. I was about to agree when we heard it again, that soft creak of a door, closer this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hallway. Silence. We stood frozen, listening, but all we heard was the sound of our own breathing. "Let's get out of here," Charlie said, turning back toward the stairs. "This place is messed up." We hurried back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But as we reached the main floor, I froze. The front door, the one we had left slightly ajar, was closed. I was sure of it. Charlie saw it too. "Did you close that?" I shook my head, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But before we could move, we heard the door creak open behind us. Slowly, agonizingly, it swung inward, revealing the dark hallway beyond. And standing in the doorway was a figure, pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted, skeletal frame. It stood motionless, watching us, its breath rattling in the silence. We didn't wait to see what it wanted. Charlie and I ran, bolting for the back of the asylum, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it behind us, its presence pressing down on us like a weight. We burst through a side door and into the night, gasping for breath. The asylum loomed behind us, dark and silent once more. But as we raced back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever was inside the asylum was still watching us, waiting for us to come back. And I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be the last time I saw it. When I first moved into the apartment on Weaver's Lane, I was drawn in by its old-world charm. The street had a quiet, forgotten feel to it, with its narrow sidewalks, faded brick buildings, and trees that had been growing there for decades, their roots cracking the concrete beneath them. The apartment itself wasn't much, small, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows, but the rent was cheap, and I liked the idea of living in a place with some history. The neighbors kept to themselves. I'd nod to them as I passed, but they never said much, only offering brief, forced smiles as they shuffled inside their apartments. I figured they were just the quiet, private type. I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for new friends. I just needed a place to get away from everything, a fresh start after a rough couple of years. But from the first night, something felt off. It started with the noises. As I unpacked boxes in my living room, I heard footsteps outside my apartment door, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a neighbor was restless, or someone was moving around late at night. But when I opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off, but the uneasiness lingered. The building was old, probably just creaky. I went back to unpacking, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The footsteps returned that night while I was lying in bed, this time louder, more distinct. They stopped just outside my door, and then I heard a soft knock. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I stayed frozen for a moment, listening to the silence. The knock didn't come again. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty, just like before. I stood there, my eye pressed to the peephole, waiting, but no one appeared. After a few minutes, I locked the door and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I brushed it off. It was probably just my imagination, heightened by the fact that I was still getting used to the place. I went about my day, but the strange feeling of being watched never fully left me. The building was eerily quiet, too quiet for a place with so many tenants. There were no sounds of TVs blaring, no conversations drifting through the walls, just an almost oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. That night, the knocking returned. It was soft at first, almost timid, but persistent. Then the footsteps again, slow, deliberate. I lay there, frozen in bed, listening. This time the knock was louder, more forceful. I didn't get up. Something deep inside me told me not to answer the door. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head, my heart racing as the knocking continued. Eventually, it stopped, but I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided to talk to my landlord, Mrs. Harlow, an older woman who lived in the unit above mine. She had a reputation for being a bit eccentric, but I figured she'd be able to explain the strange noises. When I brought it up, though, her reaction was unsettling. "The noises?" she repeated, her voice suddenly quiet. She looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously. "You've heard them?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's been happening every night. Footsteps, knocking. It's kind of freaking me out." Mrs. Harlow's face paled. She glanced around, as if to make sure no one was listening. "It's nothing to worry about," she said quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just the building settling. Old buildings like this. Sometimes they creak and groan. You'll get used to it." Her words didn't comfort me. In fact, they made me feel worse. There was something she wasn't telling me. Something that made her uneasy. But I didn't push her. Instead, I nodded and thanked her, though the pit in my stomach grew heavier as I walked away. That night, the footsteps came again, but they were louder this time, closer. The knocking returned, more insistent, like someone or something was determined to get inside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with fear. Then, the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible, like someone was speaking just on the other side of the wall. I couldn't make out any words, just the soft, insistent murmur of voices, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the whispers seemed to come from all around me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, something slamming against the wall in the hallway, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. My heart was in my throat as I stumbled out of bed, rushing to the door. I hesitated before opening it, fear gnawing at my insides. But when I finally did, the hallway was empty. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old and wooden, with paint peeling off its surface. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. I stood frozen, staring at it, trying to remember if it had always been there. But I couldn't. And then the door creaked open, slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to get back inside, to lock the door and never come out. But something pulled me forward. Curiosity, fear, I don't know what it was. I stepped toward the door, my legs trembling with each step. As I got closer, the air grew colder, almost suffocating, and the whispers became clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. I reached the door, peering inside. The room beyond was small and dimly lit by a flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with photographs, old yellowed photographs, some of them curling at the edges. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside for a closer look. The people in the photographs were standing in this very hallway, but their faces were twisted in expressions of terror. Some of the photos were old, the people dressed in clothing from decades past, but others were more recent. The most recent photo was of a young woman, her face gaunt and her eyes wide with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at her. Then I saw the last photograph on the wall. It was of me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The photo was crystal clear. Me, standing in the hallway, staring into the open door, just as I had been moments before. My mouth went dry, and I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, and the light bulb flickered violently before going out entirely. I was plunged into darkness, the air thick with the sound of voices I couldn't understand. I backed up against the wall, feeling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the darkness, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped just in front of me, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, a voice spoke directly into my ear, clear as day. "You shouldn't have come here." I screamed and pounded on the door, desperate to escape. After what felt like an eternity, it finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The air outside was heavy, oppressive, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me as I rushed back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for many nights after that. The next morning, I packed up my things and left Weaver's Lane for good. As I drove away, I glanced back at the old building in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window of my apartment, watching me leave. I never went back to Weaver's Lane, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, faint but unmistakable, like the building is calling me back. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that apartment hasn't let go of me, and it never will.